Have you ever experienced something so tragic, so traumatic, that even after years after it happened, you still find yourself thinking about it, or even feeling the same ways you felt about it after days after it happened? That's because even after recovery, trauma can stay with the person and affect their lives. In the book A Little Life, Hanya Yanagihara depicts trauma three ways: physically, psychologically, and sexually. According to Will Brett from Heart and Oak Therapy, traumatic experiences aren't like your run of the mill hard times or challenges. They're profoundly upsetting and distressing on a deeper, more personal level, making them hard not to revisit as time goes on. And by using this source and others, I have learned that trauma is beyond the situation that can happen to a person. There are also the feelings a person is left with, and how those feelings can stick with that person throughout their lives. In this speech, I will explore these topics and explain how Yanagihara expresses these three types of trauma using one of her main characters, Jude. The first type of trauma Hana Yanagihara explores is physical trauma. The two types of physical traumas are blunt force traumas and penetrating trauma. Yanagihara's main character, Jude, experiences blunt trauma when a sadistic psychiatrist named Dr. Trailer abducts Jude and crushes him beneath his car, leaving Jude debilitated, causing agonizing pain and limited mobility for the rest of his life. It was imperative that Jude live in an apartment with an elevator just because the stairs would cause too much strain on his legs. Physical trauma is one of the big T traumas, according to licensed psychologist Alyssa Barbash. She goes on to say that it is an extraordinary and significant event that leaves the individual feeling powerless and possessing little control in their environment. With this trauma, Jude was forced to relive it and experience its effects decades after it happened. The trauma was so bad that Jude had to get his legs amputated due to a bone infection. Although physical traumas are horrible, you still shouldn't discredit the other types of traumas just because you can't visibly see them. Which brings us to our next type of trauma, psychological trauma. The three main types of psychological trauma are acute, chronic, or complex. Acute trauma stems from a singular traumatic incident. Chronic trauma is varied and multiple traumatic events like domestic violence or abuse. Complex trauma compromises childhood development and can have long-term effects into adulthood. Jude experiences chronic and complex traumas. The most apparent chronic trauma Jude experiences was with his boyfriend Caleb. Caleb emotionally manipulates Jude by relentlessly degrading Jude and is disgusted by his disability. At this point, Jude is in a wheelchair due to the aforementioned physical abuses. Caleb also beats and sexually assaults Jude, leaving him feeling worthless and undeserving of love, which carries into his future relationships with his friends and partners. Jude has experienced many complex traumas from his childhood, which affected his relationship with his friend and eventual adopted family in his adulthood. When Jude was younger, he was left at a monastery as an infant, where he was physically and sexually abused by several men, including one character named Brother Luke, who took advantage of his naivety by running away with Jude and making him feel like he was safe while sexually abusing him. Brother Luke also taught Jude to self-mutilate in order to relieve his mental pain, which Jude carried into his adult life, often going too far and ending up in the hospital because of it. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network says, since these events often occur with the caregiver, they interfere with the child's ability to form a secure attachment. We can see this in Jude because of his inability to trust anyone enough to tell them his full story, only revealing it in a letter to his friends and family when he eventually commits suicide. Complex traumas are so detrimental to childhood development, as they can lead to unhealthy habits as the child grows into adulthood. These habits and bad self-images can follow them. Sexual trauma can also be considered a complex trauma, especially in this case. When Jude was at the monastery, he suffered sexual abuse from many of the men there. When Jude told Brother Luke of these occurrences, Brother Luke manipulated Jude, making himself feel like the Jude's savior, due to the fact that he himself didn't abuse him yet, and would eventually lead Jude away from the monastery. Jude developed a trusting relationship with Brother Luke due to his manipulation and would follow his every order. When Jude and Brother Luke ran away together in order to pay for things like food and shelter, Luke sold Jude as a child prostitute out of motel rooms while also sexually assaulting Jude himself. Even after this, when Jude gets sent to an orphanage and eventually runs away, Jude sells himself to men in exchange for truck rides across the country. Sexual traumas like these can stay with people and affect their future relationships. The Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse says relationships can remind victims and survivors of sexual abuse, and there may be emotional barriers that make it difficult to talk about sexual abuse with partners. This is evident in Jude's eventual relationship with another main character, Willem, when Jude is uncomfortable with any sexual act, even though the two have a very healthy relationship. Without proper treatment or healing, all the traumas I have covered can lead to unhealthy relationships with the person and their relationships. As I end my speech, I'd like to say, although these topics are uncomfortable and triggering, it is imperative that there be a conversation addressing the topic of trauma. I have covered only physical, psychological, and sexual, but there are a multitude of other types of traumas. Recovering from trauma is important and necessary to sustaining life and achieving fulfilling and genuine relationships. Larry Ronberg from the New York Times says, overcoming adversity can lead to growth and fulfillment, and an ability to overcome the many inevitable difficulties we all face. Trauma is very terrible, but a very real thing that unfortunately most people go through. But as long as we keep talking about it and learning new ways to help people learn to live with it, we can heal from it and understand these harmful and damaging experiences. Thank you.